First attempt at recording my slides, and it might be a little rough at first, and hopefully I'll get better at it. But hopefully by the time I get better at it, we'll all be back in school. So I want to talk to you about our LG1 slides, which talks a lot about the geography of Japan. Very unique geography. Japan obviously is not just one island, it's actually many islands and four major islands created by volcanic action, and as you may have learned in science, it's part of the Ring of Fire. So geography has a lot of impact on how life is lived in Japan. One of which is another part of our main ideas of the LG1 component, is that people began living in small clans, basically because they were separated by the many mountains of Japan. And eventually Japan did unite under one emperor, but it took a long time. And we're also going to find out that Japan was highly impacted by its neighbors, China and Korea. So, as I mentioned before, Japan is a large group of islands, and the four main islands. And I'm going to show you this in Google Earth. So I'm just going through this right now, but I'm going to show you and give you visual insight as to what I'm talking about. The four main islands are Hokkaido, Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku. And if I pronounce them wrong, I'm sorry, because I don't know how to pronounce all the Japanese words. The one that I usually point out, the main island, is Honshu. And in this day and age of the coronavirus, if somebody sneezes and says Honshu, you say God bless you. But that's the main island, and that's my little coronavirus joke there. Because of the fact that Japan is not, geographically large, and there is a lot of mountains, it makes the rivers be short but also swift moving. I'm actually going to show you one of the main rivers of Japan, and you'll see that there's not much buildup around it because of that short, swift moving river is probably very susceptible to flooding. If you think of Japan as being kind of mountains that erupted out of the sea because of the ocean, it's in the ocean, it's basically volcanoes in the ocean. Really, the Japan itself is really the top of these large underwater mountains that come out of the Pacific. And I'm also going to show you images of the land of Japan. You're going to see that most of it is kind of green and not really built up, and that's because it's 80% mountain and 20% flat land. But where people live is on that flat land. And I already mentioned that Japan is located on the Ring of Fire, which again is, with your plate tectonics, it's, in a very volatile region where there's a lot of volcanic action, earthquakes, and when you have earthquakes over the ocean, you're also dealing with tsunamis. So I'm going to pause here for a second, and then I'm going to come back and show you some things on Google Earth. Quite sure, so like I said, I'll probably get better as time goes on. But we're now looking at Google Earth, and as you can see here, and I'll use my mouse, wrong mouse, okay, that's the islands of Japan. All right, and it's in the Pacific Ocean. You can see the underwater mountains there. That Japan is actually just the top of those mountains from the seismic activity that takes place along basically the Ring of Fire. Any Johnny Cash fans out there might know that song. And I also want to point out why we're looking at this is that you got their neighbors, North and South Korea, which again wasn't always North and South Korea. It was just Korea. The Korean War in the 1950s caused the two halves of Korea to separate, and the other large neighbor is China. Okay, and you can see that they have the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan in between. Seems like it's not that much space in between, but that amount of water did keep Japan quite isolated. But their early context would be with Korea and China. And one of the things that Japan had in its favor was that because of its mountains, was easily defensible. So the Japanese people could pretty much decide, like, do they want to interact with the Koreans? And if they do, well, we'll invite them to come and trade and give us ideas. And same with the Chinese. And if we don't, then we're going to make sure they don't get on our island. And they were easily defensible against them. All right, so I'm going to shift over here, and then one of the cities you may be familiar with is Tokyo. It's the capital. It wasn't always the capital. We'll learn that there were other capitals of Japan. In the medieval times, it was called Edo. Now it's called Tokyo. But actually, you can see here, and again, I'll point out the mountains here. The green areas are all the mountains, and this grayish area, you might think, well, that's that flatland. Actually, it's the cities of Japan with the populations. So you can see that the populations are highly centered in small areas, while there's lots of mountains out there separating them. And that's one of the reasons why they had, in the early period of Japan, lots of small clans who would gain a power base in their little area, and then they would fight amongst the other clans and maybe intermarry with the other clans. But eventually, then one powerful emperor and ultimately a shogun would take over and control the islands of Japan. I will point also out that Tokyo has a very convenient harbor there, which would make it a great place for trade to take place. All right. All right, so let's move on to another location here. I'm going to hit forward, and we're going to cruise on down to the highest point in Japan, and it's Mount Fuji. And as I get closer, you can kind of see that Mount Fuji is in actuality a volcano. So that is the highest point in Japan, but there are many other mountains, and again, a lot of these mountains are volcanoes. All right, so moving right along, I mentioned in the notes that Japan has 4 islands. So I'm going to show you the 4 major islands. There's lots of small islands. You can see there's lots of small islands all around here that I'm not going to talk about. But this is Kyushu. It's on the southern end. All right, the next island that I'll show you is the Big Island. And once again, that's Honshu. God bless you. All right, and then the next island just south of Honshu is Shikuko. Once again, probably mispronounced. Now, the entire internet will know that I sometimes mispronounce some of these difficult words, but that's okay. And then the northern island, and actually the northern island has a very unique characteristics. It's definitely colder. And the people that we're going to learn about, called the Ainu, originally inhabited this island, and that's Hokkaido. All right, and then the last thing I'm going to zoom in here to show you is that river that I talked about. And this is the Tone River here. Again, it kind of runs just north of Tokyo and through Tokyo, and you can see that there's city and developments all around it. But if you move in closer, you'll see that along the river, there's nothing built up there, and that would be a clear indicator that the Japanese are well aware of the fact that the Tone River, from time to time, probably seasonally, will overflow, and therefore I'm sure there's building restrictions alongside that river. Again, the rivers, as I mentioned in the notes before, are very short and very swift moving, and again, I would say very prone to flooding. All right, so I'm going to pause this again, and then we'll get back to the notes. Okay, I think I'm back, and we're going through these notes again. And reading through that first box there, it's pretty safe to say that the sea influenced Japan by providing its food. They pretty much ate fish. So you do see seaweed in there, and for those of you who are sushi fans, know that sushi is wrapped up in seaweed, and along with the raw fish and seaweed is the addition of also rice, which would be the main crop that was grown in the very limited amount of farming land that Japan would have. Japan, as I also mentioned, was very isolated, but once people started making better ships and better sea vessels that could travel the Sea of Japan and the Sea of East China Sea, then Japan could also be very interactive with its neighbors. But it was Japan's choice about when they wanted to be isolated and when they wanted to be interactive. It is interesting to note that if you look at Japanese history, that when Japan decides to interact with the outside world, Japan has become a very powerful and formidable nation, to the point where they were a problem for us in the period of World War II. And they are very powerful and financially strong today. But when they're isolated, they tend to go backwards. Japan, when it interacts with the world, can be a very powerful nation, but when it decides to isolate, it has limited resources, so it's very difficult for them to be a powerful nation. And again, the number one trading partners and influencers on early Japanese society would be China and Korea. Okay, the next slide I want to talk about is that there were two different ethnic groups that began in Japan. One ethnic group would be called the Japanese, and the other was the Ainu. And the Ainu and Japanese kind of shared the Japanese islands for many years until eventually the Ainu, simply through intermarriage and probably warfare, eventually started to be very hard to find. And there's very few people in Japan right now that would consider themselves of Ainu descent, much like there's very few people in the United States today that would say that they are of Native American background, because the Native Americans, through warfare, disease, and other bad elements of our history, have ceased to exist to some extent. But the Ainu, there's an image here of a person of Ainu descent, and only saying this from my own observations, not necessarily proven, but if I had to look at this guy and say, what does he look like? To me, he looks like what I would imagine a Eskimo looking like. And I would point out that the Ainu were from the northern island of Japan, which is not that far from where the land bridge that would be, that a lot of historians think that early humans traveled across to get to Alaska. So it may bring some logic behind them looking somewhat like Eskimos. Okay, as mentioned before, the early Japanese were organized into small clans, and that there would be a leader of that clan, and that clan might become quite powerful in their own region of Japan, but that these many little clans would be kind of interacting, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, and what kept them from being unified were all the mountains and hills that separated them that we saw in Google Earth. They would have a chief of their clan that would run things for them. And here's where we get into some Japanese religion. The chiefs were believed to have gotten their power through what was called kami, and kami is an element of the Shinto religion. I'm going to talk more about Shinto, and I think Shinto is pretty interesting. And normally I would do a unit on world religion, but it might be difficult for me to do that this year, the way things are. So I will talk a little bit about Shinto. And basically, it is the religion that the Japanese practiced. And prior to learning about other religions, they didn't even call it a name. It was just a Japanese religion. Began being called Shinto when they started to interact with Korea and China and learned about other religions like Buddhism and Confucianism. So for Shinto, the Japanese believed that kami were everywhere, and that kami would be in the air, in the mountains, they could be in trees, in the sea, and that there were countless numbers of kami, which would then make this basically a polytheistic religion. And you may recognize the shrine that you see there on screen. That's called a torii gate. If anybody's ever been to Epcot and Disney World, you might hear my dogs in the background. But the torii gates are a very common image that we see going into Japanese restaurants, etc. And those torii gates is where the Shinto believers would identify as being the gate between the real world and the kami world. So I'm going to take a break here, and we're going to look at some images of other Shinto shrines, along with some notes that I have for another unit, and I'll explain a little bit more with some Japanese background, music in the background. The Shinto religion has no founder. It began as early as 1000 BCE and was practiced in Japan throughout that time. It blended with Confucianism, Buddhism, and other religions for many years. In the era of World War II, the state religion was Shinto, and when the Japanese lost World War II, they were forced to recognize that their emperors were not descendants of the sun god Amaterasu. When followers of Shinto enter a shrine, they purify with water, give gifts to the kami, they ring bells, bow twice, and clap twice to get the attention of the kami, who they hope will give them positive outcomes in their lives. I know a lot of you are interested in the Greek myths and some of the Viking folk tales, and so the stories of the kami and Izanagi and Izanami and their children, including Amaterasu, the sun goddess, are very interesting. And so I'm going to put some reading materials up on Google Classroom where you can learn more about these very interesting stories within the Shinto religion. Just spent 5 minutes recording this before and made so many mistakes that I had to do it again. So I'm just going to warn you that I might be a mistake or two into this and still let it just run through. That being said, the first emperors, when Japan first became unified, I mentioned before that they, in the earliest stages of its history, were ruled by many, many clans. And eventually, a more powerful clan came along that would claim to control all of Japan. And we know about these clans from two books, one mentioned in the notes, one not. One is called the Nihonji in the notes, and it's a chronicle of Japan which lists all the emperors. Another one that was written was called the Kojiki. Both of these were written in around the 8th century CE, after these emperors had supposedly existed. A lot of the writing doesn't take place until they encounter the Chinese, where they learn the writing from. So we hear about these early emperors from these books that were written thousands or not, hundreds of years after the events. The first clan to claim to have controlled all of Japan was the Yamato clan. And they actually are the clan that claims that they were descendants of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. And so all Japanese emperors, all the way through to World War II, claimed to be a descendant of Amaterasu. And one of the terms of the peace treaty ending World War II was that Japan was allowed to keep their emperor, but that emperor could no longer claim descendancy from the sun goddess, which shows you the importance that the Japanese people put into the history of their Shinto traditions. So the Yamato clan eventually, if I said clan again, I'm sorry. I just keep on saying clan instead of clan. But they eventually claim most of control of the big island of Honshu. And at that time, the capital was not in Tokyo. It was in a city called Nara. And I'll explain how. But their city and their capital was designed to model the Chinese capital of Chang'an. Okay, so why did they model it after China? And the answer to that is that under this new unified rule, Japan was kind of interested in what was going on in China and Korea, and they sent emissaries or representatives to go to China and Korea and find out how they were doing things, and brought them back to Japan and adopted some of the Chinese and Korean beliefs. Like I said, they learned how to write from the Chinese. Other religions were spreading in those regions at that time. One was Confucianism, which, if you are a fan of fortune cookies, you've probably read about Confucius from time to time. He had a lot of nuggets of wisdom that were put into fortune cookies. And another religion called Buddhism that was started by a founder named Siddhartha Gautama, who eventually became the Buddha, and his religion was soon to be called Buddhism. So those things come from China and Korea. And one of the people in this early period of Japanese history who brought these ideas over was a leader of Japan named Prince Shotoku. He was a regent, meaning that he was not the emperor of Japan, his aunt was. Um, and it was kind of cool that the Japanese at this early time would allow a female empress because she's the first documented female empress. But sadly, they didn't feel like she could rule on her own, so her nephew was assigned to be her regent. And it's later in the notes, but I'll mention it now, that there is evidence that at times Shotoku would do something that his aunt Suiko would be against, and she would stand her ground and say, "Listen, I'm the empress, I'm in charge." At other times, she gave deference to Shotoku to do as he saw fit. So there was a little bit of a give and take in the way that they ruled Japan. But Shotoku definitely admired the Chinese culture and did a lot to bring all that over to Japan. And so that's how a lot of the traditions of Japan kind of mirror China. If you look at the history of those two nations, they are highly competitive and many times have not always gotten along, and there's been a lot of conflict between them. So I find it kind of ironic that the early Japanese history was modeled after Chinese history. Okay, so I'm going to take a break and we're going to review what we've learned here in LG1, and then I'm going to wrap up our first video. Positive things of this is allows me to bring us back to the first slide and to address the method of my madness. And this first slide, which is labeled LG1, says that Japan's early societies were influenced by geography and nearby China and Korea. So, and then it lays down the three main ideas. All right, we talked about geography and the fact that Japan has many islands surrounded by the sea, that the many islands were volcanic, and therefore they do have to deal with the time to time earthquake and tsunami and the seismic activity that comes with that. And then all these mountains made so that the islands developed in small little pockets where small clans were able to gain power over just a small region, and that these clans sometimes got along, sometimes didn't. But eventually the clans would come together and be ruled by a single emperor. In later learning goals, we'll talk about how at times Japan was not ruled by an emperor, but a shogun. But in essence, it's the same thing, just different title. And then we also learned how the early stages of Japan were highly influenced by their neighbors, both China and Korea. So these are the main ideas of LG1, and hopefully you've processed them. And I also will tell you that you should look at your potential questions, 1 through 10, and make sure that you know those answers. You can get the answers from my notes that I just provided for you, the notes that you can look at and read now on your own, as well as the text and the reading packets that you've been given as well too. So to close this out, I'm going to play a song of the traditional Japanese national anthem. I don't know if it's the current national anthem or not. And just have various images of Japan to show you what Japan looks like today. And I will look forward to putting together another video for LG2, LG3, and LG4 as we go along. And once again, I want to wish everybody well. Hopefully everybody's healthy and getting through this, and look forward to seeing you guys all in person.